I don't know where you got this kind of child that defies growth from, he said bitterly. This must be something in your blood. Tolani's face flushed with anger. How dare you say such a thing to me, Alabi? There is no deformity in my family. If anything, it must be from your side. Tolani had just given birth to her first child. She had married Alabi only a year before, and their home was always filled with laughter and joy. When they welcomed their baby girl into the world, their happiness grew even brighter. She is beautiful, Tolani whispered, gazing at her tiny daughter, who lay softly sleeping in her arms. Alabi was at her side, his eyes shining with pride. Together, they named her Tiwa, a name that meant ours. And indeed, she was theirs, a child they already loved deeply. News of Tiwa's birth spread quickly through the village, and friends and neighbors came to see her, bringing gifts of clothes, cowries, and sweet-smelling herbs. The old women sang songs of joy, and the men shook Alabi's hand, patting his back and congratulating him. The whole village celebrated, for a new life was always a blessing, a gift to be cherished. As Tolani and Alabi watched Tiwa in those early days, they imagined all the things she would do as she grew. They dreamed of her first steps, her first words, and the day she would run through the village, her laughter filling the air. Alabi spoke of how he would teach her to farm and sing songs while working, just as his father had taught him. Tolani imagined braiding her daughter's hair and teaching her to cook and weave. These were their dreams, simple yet full of hope. She would be strong like you, Tolani said to Alabi one evening as they sat beside Tiwa's crib. Alabi laughed, gently touching his daughter's tiny hand. Maybe, he replied, or maybe she will be gentle, like you. They both chuckled, lost in their dreams. But dreams, as beautiful as they are, sometimes lead us down paths we do not expect. The months went by, and Alabi and Tolani continued to care for their little Tiwa with all the love they could give. But as time passed, a worry began to settle in their hearts. Something was not right. In the same village, another family had welcomed twin babies on the same day Tiwa was born. These twin boys were growing quickly, just as one would expect. They had started to smile, roll over, and even sit up. Each day, the twins seemed to grow bigger and stronger, but Tiwa remained the same. She was still as small and fragile as the day she was born. Her tiny arms and legs showed no signs of growing, and her face remained as round and soft as a newborn's. At first, Tolani and Alabi told themselves that every child grew at their own pace. They reassured each other that Tiwa just needed a little more time. But as weeks turned into months, they began to worry. While other babies in the village started to crawl, sit, and play, Tiwa could barely lift her head. Her body was weak, and she was as small as the day they had brought her home from the midwife. One afternoon, Tolani watched from her doorway as the twin boys toddled around the village, laughing and chasing after butterflies. Their mother laughed as they stumbled and fell, then picked themselves up again, taking small, wobbly steps with chubby legs. A deep sadness filled Tolani's heart. She looked down at Tiwa, who lay quietly in her arms, not moving much at all. The difference between Tiwa and the twins was stark, and it could no longer be ignored. I think we should take her to the herbalist, Tolani told Alabi that evening, her voice filled with worry. Maybe he can tell us why she isn't growing. Alabi nodded, though his heart was heavy with fear. He didn't want to admit it, but he had noticed it too. Something was wrong, and it seemed that Tiwa would not grow as they had hoped. So, the next day, Tolani wrapped Tiwa in a cloth and carried her to the village herbalist, an old man named Babatunde who was known for his wisdom. He looked at Tiwa, touching her small hands and legs, Feeling the softness of her tiny bones, his face grew serious. "There is no sickness in her body," Babatunde said, shaking his head slowly. "But there is something unusual about her growth. She may never grow like other children." Tolani's heart sank. She looked at Alabi, who had a look of worry and helplessness in his eyes. "Are you saying she will always remain like this?" Alabi asked in a hushed voice. Babatunde nodded slowly. "I am afraid so. There are things we do not understand, things that even the oldest of us cannot change. I have seen this only once before, and long time ago. The child was loved and cared for, but their growth remained small, as if time had stopped for them." Tolani felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wanted to hold on to hope, but Babatunde's words weighed heavily on her heart. This was not what they had dreamed for Tiwa, and she could feel the beginning of a sadness that would soon become very difficult to bear. In the following weeks, Tolani and Alabi tried to accept Babatunde's words, but their hearts would not rest. They could not bring themselves to believe that Tiwa would not grow. They couldn't accept that she would stay this way forever. They decided to seek help from everyone they could think of. Tolani took Tiwa to every herbalist in the neighboring villages, hoping that someone might know of a cure. She consulted elders, visited shrines, and sought blessings from wise men and women. Each time, she would return home with herbs, powders, and instructions on how to prepare special mixtures. Each night, she would feed Tiwa a new medicine, hoping that by morning, there would be a change. But Tiwa remained the same. Her small body showed no sign of growing, and she remained weak, unable to sit, crawl, or even make the sounds that other babies of her age had begun to make. Tolani and Alabi continued to hold on to hope, refusing to give up. They performed countless rituals, sacrificed animals, and prayed to every deity they could think of, begging for a miracle. They spent money they did not have, borrowing from neighbors and selling small pieces of land to pay for the rituals. But no matter how hard they tried, nothing seemed to help. As time went on, their hope began to turn into shame. Whenever they carried Tiwa around the village, they could feel the stares of the villagers. People whispered and pointed, and some even laughed. They called her names, saying that she was cursed, or her parents must have done something terrible to deserve such a fate. One day, as Tolani walked through the village, holding Tiwa in her arms, a woman approached her, shaking her head with pity. "It's a shame," the woman said quietly. "Such a burden you have to carry. If it were me, I don't know if I could bear it." Tolani forced a smile, but her heart was heavy. She wanted to shout at the woman, to tell her that Tiwa was not a burden, that she was their daughter, and that they loved her no matter what. But deep down, she knew that the woman's words were echoing what many others thought. At home, the strain of caring for Tiwa and bearing the villagers' judgment began to wear on Tolani and Alabi's relationship. They were once so close, laughing and dreaming together, but now their days were filled with silence and sadness. One night, after another visit to a herbalist who had given them yet another potion that did nothing, Alabi spoke words that Tolani would never forget. "I don't know where you got this kind of child that defies growth from," he said bitterly. "This must be something in your blood." Tolani's face flushed with anger. "How dare you say such a thing to me, Alabi? There is no deformity in my family. If anything, it must be from your side." Alabi's voice grew louder. "Don't turn this on me, Tolani. My family has no such history. It's you, your family, who has brought this curse upon us." The words stung, cutting deeper than Tolani could bear. She stormed out of the room, feeling hurt and alone. In that moment, she realized that the love they had once shared had been replaced by bitterness and blame. As the years passed, Tiwa remained small, weak, and unable to walk or crawl. Her arms were thin, Her legs were fragile, and her face still held the innocence of a child much younger than her age. By the time she reached 5 years old, the twins who had been born on the same day were running and playing all over the village. They would race around the hut, shouting and laughing, while Tiwa lay in her mother's lap, watching them with quiet, curious eyes. People in the village had grown used to the sight of Tolani and Alabi carrying Tiwa in their arms, but no one could miss the sadness in her parents' eyes as they held her, or the tension that now filled their home. They still loved their daughter, but the weight of her condition had made them bitter and tired. They argued often, and each argument seemed to make them drift further apart. Tolani, who had once been a joyful woman, became withdrawn and quiet. She stopped attending village gatherings and festivals. She avoided the women who once had been her friends, knowing that they whispered about her behind her back. Sometimes, as she walked through the village carrying Tiwa, she could hear their whispers. "Poor woman," someone would murmur. "She has to carry that child everywhere. She can't even walk." Another would shake her head, saying, "What a burden. How can she bear it?" And yet another voice would add, "Who knows what sin she committed to have a child like that?" Tolani tried to ignore the whispers, but they grew louder with each passing day, until she couldn't escape them even in her own mind. She started to wonder if maybe the villagers were right. Maybe she had done something to deserve this. She began to feel ashamed of her own daughter, a feeling that filled her with guilt and sorrow. Alabi was no better. He became impatient and quick-tempered, snapping at Tolani over the smallest things. Every time he looked at Tiwa, he was reminded of all the things she would never do. She would never run, never dance, never play like the other children. Instead, she would always be small and weak, unable to do anything on her own. One evening, after yet another day of enduring the villagers' stares and whispers, Alabi couldn't contain his frustration any longer. "This isn't fair," he said, pacing back and forth in their small hut. "This isn't the life I wanted. I didn't ask for a child who would stay like this forever." Tolani looked up at him, hurt by his words. "She is our daughter, Alabi," she said softly. "She didn't choose to be this way. It's not her fault." Alabi shook his head. "Maybe not, but it feels like a curse. Don't you see how the villagers look at us? They pity us. They think we are cursed, and maybe we are." Tolani felt tears in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "She needs us, Alabi. If we don't love her, who will?" But Alabi only turned away, unable to face the truth of her words. As Tiwa grew older, her awareness of her situation deepened. By the time she was 10 years old, she understood much more than her parents realized. Though her body had hardly changed, her mind was sharp and observant. She could see the sadness in her mother's eyes, the frustration in her father's voice, and the way they avoided each other. Tiwa knew that she was different. She knew that her parents struggled because of her, and that her condition had driven them apart. She had heard them arguing in hushed voices at night, each blaming the other for her stunted growth. And she knew, though they never said it, that she was the reason they were unhappy. Sometimes, Tiwa would lie awake at night, her heart heavy with sadness. She wanted so badly to be like the other children, to walk and run and play. She wanted to be able to help her mother with chores or follow her father to the fields. But she was trapped in the body that refused to grow, a body that kept her small and helpless. The older she got, the more she longed for something different. She wanted freedom, strength, and the chance to be like everyone else. She wanted her parents to look at her with pride instead of sorrow. And more than anything, she wanted them to love her, truly love her the way she saw other parents love their children. But every day, she could feel the distance between them growing. Her parents cared for her, they fed her, carried her, and made sure she was safe. But it was not the love she longed for. It was more like duty, a burden they had to bear, and she felt the weight of it pressing down on her, squeezing her heart. At 18, Tiwa was still the size of a small child. Her body had grown only a little over the years, but it was not enough. She was still unable to walk, and her legs were too weak to carry her weight. Her parents still had to feed her, bathe her, and carry her wherever she needed to go. And each day, the pain in her heart grew stronger. She began to feel like a burden, an unwanted presence that brought nothing but sorrow to her family. She could hear the villagers whispering, saying things like, "She will never be like us. She's cursed, poor thing," or "Her parents must have done something terrible to deserve this." These words cut deep, but it was her parents' silent rejection that hurt her most. Every time they looked away from her, every time they avoided her touch or her gaze, she felt a little piece of herself crumble. She wished with all her heart that things could be different, but no matter how hard she wished, nothing changed. The sorrow and loneliness became too much to bear. Tiwa began to wonder if maybe it would be better if she weren't there at all. She thought about the pain her parents endured because of her, the shame they felt because she couldn't grow. She thought about how the villagers looked at her with pity and whispered about her being cursed. And one night, when the pain in her heart felt heavier than ever, Tiwa made a heartbreaking decision. Late one night, after her parents had gone to bed, Tiwa lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. The house was silent, and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets outside. She waited, listening to the quiet breathing of her parents in the next room. When she was certain they were asleep, she carefully pulled herself out of bed and crawled across the floor. Her heart pounded as she made her way to the kitchen, moving as quietly as she could. She reached for the small bottle of kerosene that her mother kept for the lantern, her hands shaking as she held it. She knew what she was about to do, and though it filled her with fear, it also brought her a strange sense of peace. In that moment, Tiwa believed that this was the only way to escape the pain. She thought of her parents, of how much they would be relieved without her. She thought of the villagers, of how they would no longer have to whisper or pity her. And she thought of herself, of how she would finally be free from the shame, the sorrow, and the unending loneliness. With a heavy heart, she lifted the bottle to her lips and drank the kerosene. The taste was bitter and burnt her throat, and she felt a sharp, agonizing pain in her stomach. But even in the midst of her pain, she felt a strange kind of relief. Soon, the pain would be over. Soon, she would be free. As she lay there, her vision fading, her last thought was of the life she had always dreamed of. A life where she could walk, run, and be loved. The next morning, Tolani rose early as usual. She was accustomed to waking up first, usually to start a fire or fetch water from the nearby streams before Alabi stirred. She moved towards the kitchen to fetch the pot she would use to boil some yam. But as she stepped into the kitchen, her eyes fell upon a small still figure lying on the ground. It was Tiwa. "Tiwa!" Talani cried, rushing forward. She knelt beside her daughter, shaking her gently. "Wake up, my child!" she whispered, her voice trembling. But Tiwa did not respond. Her body was cold, and her face was still, with an expression of calm that Tolani had rarely seen in her. Panic gripped her heart as she shook Tiwa harder, calling her name over and over. Alabi, hearing his wife's cries, stumbled into the kitchen, his face a mask of confusion and worry. When he saw Tiwa lying motionless, he froze, his hands shaking. He dropped to his knees beside Tolani, who was sobbing, clutching Tiwa's small, fragile body to her chest. They tried everything they could think of to wake her, but it was too late. Tiwa had already passed. The truth hit them like a crushing wave, filling the air with a suffocating silence. Tolani's cries grew louder, her sorrow raw and uncontainable. Alabi held his head in his hands, feeling a shame and guilt so deep that he could hardly breathe. The villagers came one by one, filling their small home with murmurs and quiet condolences. Some wept, some shook their heads, but others whispered, their voices low but audible. "Why is she crying so hard?" One woman muttered, glancing at Tolani. She barely wanted the child around while she was alive. Another villager nodded, replying softly, "It's strange. She spent years looking ashamed of her daughter, and now she's acting as though she's heartbroken. Maybe she just wants people to see her mourning." Someone else added, rolling their eyes, "People will say anything to save face." Despite their words, Tolani and Alabi could not hear them. They were lost in their own world of grief and regret, too devastated to notice the gossip around them. Tiwa was buried that evening, her small body laid to rest under the shade of a tree, away from the stares of the villagers. That night, as Tolani and Alabi lay on their bed, the weight of their sorrow pressed down on them like a heavy stone. The both felt the crushing guilt of having failed their only child, and they couldn't escape the truth of what they had done, or rather, what they had failed to do. They had never truly accepted Tiwa, had never loved her as she was, and now she was gone, leaving them with nothing but regrets. In the days following Tiwa's death, Tolani and Alabi tried to carry on, but nothing felt the same. Their once lively home was now filled with silence, the echoes of laughter and dreams long gone. Everywhere they looked, they saw reminders of Tiwa, the small bed where she used to sleep, the little stool where she would sit while they fed her, the blanket she had clutched every night. Tolani found herself unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Tiwa's face, her eyes wide with sadness, a small hand reaching out for comfort. She would toss and turn, unable to escape the feeling that her daughter's spirit was near, watching her with silent reproach. Then the nightmares began. One night, as Tolani drifted off into a restless sleep, she found herself standing alone in a misty, shadowy place. In the distance, she saw a small figure sitting on the ground, her head bowed low. Tolani's heart leaped as she recognized her daughter. "Tiwa," she whispered, stepping forward. Tiwa lifted her head, and Tolani saw that her eyes were filled with tears. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of sadness and accusation. "Why didn't you love me, Mama?" Tiwa asked softly. Her voice echoed through the mist, each word piercing Tolani's heart. "Why did you feel ashamed of me?" Tolani's throat tightened as she reached out, trying to touch her daughter's hand, but Tiwa's form began to fade, slipping away like mist between her fingers. I'm sorry, Tiwa," Tolani cried, but her daughter's image disappeared, leaving her alone in the darkness. She woke with a start, her body covered in a cold sweat. She tried to shake off the dream, but the sorrow in Tiwa's eyes lingered, haunting her throughout the day. Alabi also began to have dreams of Tiwa. In one, he saw her standing at the edge of a river, looking out across the water. She turned to him, her eyes filled with longing. "Baba, why did you see me as a burden?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet sadness. "All I wanted was your love." Alabi awoke from the dream, feeling as though his heart was breaking all over again. The words replayed in his mind, each one a reminder of his failure to love his daughter fully. He had been so focused on his own shame, his own disappointment, that he had forgotten to see the beauty and worth in the child he was given. As the days turned into weeks, Tolani and Alabi found themselves unable to escape these nightmares. They became shadows of their former selves, haunted by the memory of Tiwa and the life they had denied her. They had once dreamed of having many children, but now they felt that the spirit of Tiwa was preventing them from conceiving again, as though her soul was lingering, reminding them of the love they had failed to give. In their grief, Tola and Alabi found themselves spending long hours in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The dreams continued night after night until they could no longer bear the weight of their regrets. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Alabi finally spoke. "We have spent all these years running from what we could not change," he said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. We looked at Tiwa and saw only our disappointment, but we never accepted her as she was. Tolani nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I was so afraid of what others thought. She whispered, I let their words make me feel ashamed. I forgot that Tiwa was our daughter, that she deserved our love no matter what. They sat in silence, the truth of their words sinking in. They could not change the past, nor could they bring Tiwa back. But in that moment, they made a promise to honor her memory by living with a new understanding, a commitment to accept what life offered, rather than reject it out of fear or shame. In the months that followed, they began to speak openly to the villagers, sharing their story in the hopes that others would learn from their mistakes. They encouraged other parents to cherish their children as they were, reminding them that love was not something to be earned, but something to be given freely. The villagers listened, some with tears in their eyes, and many came to see Tiwa's story as a reminder of the importance of love and acceptance. Though Tiwa's life had been short and marked by sorrow, her memory became a source of wisdom for the community. As the years passed, Tolani and Alabi found a small measure of peace. They never had more children, but they poured their love into helping other families, guiding parents who struggled with their own children's differences and challenges. They knew that they could never change what had happened, but they could use their story to help others understand the importance of acceptance. In the end, Tiwa's life and memory became a lasting lesson that what we cannot change, we must learn to embrace, and that love, even when difficult, is always worth giving. If you enjoyed this story, I'm sure you will love the next one. Click to watch now. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.